So, Simi, we know from the research we've done that you're an award-winning journalist and you have a morning show, Mornings with Simi. So, if you could just kind of take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself in your own words, that would be awesome.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Simi Sara. I host Mornings with Simi on 980 CKNW, which is 5:30 to 9 a.m. Monday to Friday. I've been doing mornings for about 4+ years now, and I loved it. I love the schedule. But prior to that, I've been doing different times of a radio show. I started at NW about 15 years ago, I guess now. Originally doing 12 to 3 and then 10 to 2. And I worked in television before that, television news. And I think what I love most about radio is that it really allows for more time to be spent talking about an issue and not worrying as much about getting it squeezed into that minute or 2 minutes or whatever for television or a soundbite that's only 30 seconds. And it gives us, 7, 8 minutes at a time to talk about an issue, which I think these days you can't get that anywhere else.
So we'd love for you to share a story with us. Have you had an experience in your life that has defined you or made you stronger?
Looking back to kind of what has shaped me and where I really wanted to succeed and get my drive from there were a lot of women in my family who were high achievers. They were, they were wanted to do first. So my family came to Canada because my grandparents had 7 daughters and 4 sons, and they wanted to make sure that their daughters had just as many opportunities as their sons did. And that was something I heard a lot when I was growing up about, you better not squander this opportunity that you've been given to come here and do a lot. And my mom was a single working mom, and she worked really, really hard. She worked for the government. She worked for the government of Canada, and she loved her job. And that was like a huge influence for me, for somebody who, like a woman who was working full time, and this is in the 70s and the 80s. And she really loved her work and devoted herself to her work. And I could see how big that was for her. Now, she passed away when she was 43 in a car accident. So I was 18 at the time. And her funeral was just so massive, like hundreds and hundreds of people. I still have like a suitcase full of cards that people gave me, just telling me how the work that she had done in helping them to come to Canada or navigate the immigration system was just so impactful for their life. And that always stayed with me, to be able to try to do something that she had, at 43, so young, but had already achieved so much that people felt like meeting this person and interacting with her had changed their life forever. And I think that has always stayed with me, is that when I do things and I work, I try to think of like, what would she have thought? How would she have reacted? Would she have been proud of me? And I think that's probably the biggest thing that has shaped me.
Obviously, we can see a little bit about where your drive comes from, but how did you specifically get into the career field you're in now, and what's your proudest accomplishment from your career thus far?
Honestly, my kids hate this story, is that I've always known what I wanted to do. Like always, like elementary school, junior high. I worked on the school newspaper in, I think, grade 9 or grade 10 at the junior high school that I went to. And I knew then what I wanted to do. So that was always my goal, was to get into the business. So I originally worked in newspapers. That was my first job. Then I worked in television news, and now in radio. And so I've always been doing exactly what I knew I wanted to do. So I loved news so much. And so I've done a lot. I've moved around to a lot of jobs, and yeah, great, lots of accomplishments. But honestly, having all that, but having like my 2 kids is probably the big, like having 2 kids that are healthy and happy, and, they're ambitious and they work hard. That is also probably the greatest accomplishment that I can feel in the last 30 years.
So if you got into journalism in did you say grade 9 or 10, or when you
Yeah,
were?
grade 9. I'm pretty sure might have been grade 10. I think it might have been grade 10. It was an English class that also put out the school newspaper at the junior high school. And then that was it. That was like, I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. And then
This
grade
is me.
12, there was a different school that I went to that also had a journalism class in grade 12. And I did that too, put out the school newspaper. And that was it. I was sold at that point. So
That's so cool that you knew so early on.
it's kind of cool. Like it's a great story, but it's really frustrating for like my kids, because that's not going to happen for everybody. And it's hard to explain to people that I never had any, questions about what I wanted to do. And, that I've always felt like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do. That's a gift. And not very many people get that gift. So it's hard for especially like my kids because they're not going to get that gift.
You had like an innate drive that just led you to this career in journalism.
Yeah, I've always loved news. Like even when I was little and I would travel with my parents, the first thing my dad would do when we went to any other city is buy the local newspaper because for the internet. So this is like the, early 1980s. Like I remember we went to Los Angeles in 1984 for the Olympics for like a family vacation. And I think we must have arrived there on a Sunday because I remember going with him to a corner store to buy the Sunday Los Angeles Times. And as a little kid, I was just like blown away because it was this thick. And I'd never seen a newspaper like that big before, but that was like the Sunday edition of the Los Angeles Times. And he would just always, wherever we were, whatever, go and find like some local newspapers and read them cover to cover. Then he'd ask me questions about it and he would talk about it with me. So my dad was very much like that too. And I think I definitely get that from him.
So I imagine you've covered a lot of stories that have had an impact on you throughout your career. Is there one story in particular that you've shared that has kept you up at night?
It's really, I think, probably hardest when you're a junior reporter, because that's when you get the assignments that nobody really wants, but you have no choice that you have to do it. And when I think back, the most uncomfortable things I had to do, it is probably also associated with things that news media sometimes has the worst reputation for. There has been a tragedy and you have to go knock on that family's door and you don't want to do it. But if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. And that family may feel like they have a message that they want to get out, and you're going to miss that message and somebody else is going to hear it. And so it doesn't always feel very good, but those are the things you sometimes have to do. You don't know if they don't want to speak, that's fine. Obviously, you respect that. But a lot of times when people are in that grieving process or something terrible has happened, whether it's a homicide or an accident, whatever, they do want to talk about it. They do have something that they want to raise maybe awareness about. You can help with that. You can also, it's almost like part of their grieving process, but that initial going there and finding them and knocking on the door and doing that it's those stories kind of always stay with you.
Did any of those stories ever make you question that field, I guess, or?
No, I mean, I always look, it was a necessary kind of thing that you had to do. I mean, sure, there's people who would get mad at you, but the number of times that I've also kind of sat in someone's house while they have been grieving, but also really had an important point that they wanted to make, whether it was about the justice system or laws that need to be changed or needing help in finding the person who was responsible. That's really something like only the media can help them with. So the job is very valuable and it's really important. It's not always easiest when you have to navigate those kinds of tragedies, but the end result is that you can actually help them get closure and you can help them make positive change out of it.
Being a woman in your career, were there any hurdles you faced maybe early on being a young woman or even still that
Many.
you would talk about?
How many do you want? I'll just go back to the issue of like, 'cause my kids are so important to me and my family is so important to me. But it wasn't easy having children and doing the maternity leave, especially in this business, which is so incredibly competitive. And a lot of women used to often get told that if you don't want to do this job, for instance, if I didn't want to go knock on someone's door and ask them about whatever their tragedy had been, there's a lineup of people behind you that we can ask and they will go and do it. And that's true. That is true. It's a very, very competitive job. And so I was pregnant with my daughter when I was 25 and I was a young like television reporter. And I remember that when I did tell people that, okay, yes, I'm, having a baby, that somebody actually said to me, why would you want to bring your career to a crashing halt at the age of 25 and have a baby? And I remember saying, well, I don't really think of it that way, but people did. That was, the end result for a lot of people. And I think it still is incredibly challenging for women to stay in the industry and juggle things and, manage to make that work. That we lose so many valuable and smart and capable women in this line of work because they do reach a point where if they do have kids and their kids are small and they just find that it is too challenging, it's too hard to stay in the business. Like we don't as a business make it easy. for women to stay in it. And there's just so many women that I know of who are no longer in this business because of that.
Do you think that there has been positive change in this space, or are there still like massive issues that women confront in journalism today?
I will say that huge, huge. And I'll just give you a couple of good examples of that. Like my boss right now is the mom of two very small, like elementary school, 8 and under children. Both children she had while she was working with us and on the job as our executive producer. So in both cases, she had the children, took 1 year maternity. And when I was having kids, it was a 6 month maternity leave. And I was so insecure about my job. I took 6 months with the first and 4 months with the second, because there were people waiting for my job the second. So I had to come back after 4 months on the second one. But now, like in this case, my boss right now, she took 2 years. So 1 year for the first child, and then a couple of years later, another full year for the second, came back, boom. She's the boss, and she is fantastic. She's actually my boss on a maternity leave for the actual boss, who had a baby and is coming back in a couple months. But also we're talking like the head person here of our station, who took a full year maternity leave and will be coming back into her position, no problems. And to me, that says so much about how much progress that we've made towards this, that nobody blinks an eye, at least in our company now. Nobody's going to blink an eye about that. And I know many, many young people, but I think the problem is like, will they stay? And that's, having the baby and doing the maternity leave and coming back. Okay. But once they start school, I know that it becomes even more challenging, because that burden kind of falls on women about, juggling less today than say, 20, 30 years ago, but it still is a huge burden. So will they stay in the business is the question down the line.
And is there any kind of piece of advice or a couple points of advice you would give to women that are looking to enter that field and looking for a career in journalism?
Oh, it's so hard right now. Like there's so much uncertainty in the business. Like you really do have to love it. You really do have to love kind of the news business. I don't even know if I would be able to start out, like when I see what young reporters are juggling in terms of filing, not just for if they're a television reporter, and then writing a story for digital, and they're juggling things that I didn't have to juggle back in the day. But that's the hard part. I think make sure you have to love it and stay with it, because I think these days, if you're getting in at that entry level, make sure it's your passion for sure.
So, on the note of giving advice, we're wondering if there's one piece of advice you give to young Simi.
Oh,
let's think like grade 9. You just realized that like you want to be a journalist.
I just would have told her to go for it. In fact, I did get some good advice, because there were some people that I knew at that time, like my teacher who knew people who worked at the Vancouver Sun. And I did, like, people invested in me enough to say, hey, why don't you have a chat with this person who's a reporter? And I think I did have a chat with somebody who's a reporter at the Vancouver Sun, and they were great with their time and giving me some advice to do that, and, keep reading and keep, being passionate about the news, and giving me advice about which school to go to and how to approach it. And so I would just say, keep asking questions. You can't go wrong if you just keep asking questions and keep reading and keeping up to date. But I never thought about like 10 years down the line. I always thought about what the next thing was. Like, what is the next thing I'm going to do? And not thinking that this one thing was going to be the be all end all. It was like, okay, I'm doing this now, but what is the next thing? Because there's lots of opportunities in the business to do many, many different things, and didn't ever want to say that this was going to be the last thing that I do. Although this might be the last thing that I do right now, but that's because I'm getting towards the end of my career. But all along, I think in the industry, I've probably done maybe 20 different jobs, because it was always about what looks interesting. What is the next thing I'm going to do? So always be thinking about that.
That's great. Thank you. And then kind of our final question, which is a bit heavy, so no need to, kind of respond right away, but we typically ask all of the women that we interview what being a woman means to them. So feel free to kind of take that in any direction.
I think what it means for me is, it's the joke I make. It's always something. There's always something, right? There's always some issue. There's always something that's not equitable. There's always something that needs to be dealt with. There's always, whether it's at home or whether it's at work, there's always, you kind of can never let your guard down. Like never assume there's going to be equality, never assume that that person's getting paid the same or less than you. Never assume that the boss can just see that you're doing good work with your head down and you're not going in there and asking to be recognized for it. Never assume that your manager knows what a great employee you are. Like I just don't think you can ever let your guard down about assuming people will see that you're a good worker, you're great. No, you have to make sure that you are always advocating for yourself.
Like hearing you talk about your career, I'm like, journalism sounds exhausting. I think Ken's and I, we both studied, we were like considering that path and we studied together. I think Ken's may have mentioned that when I was trying to figure out the record button. But when we were in school, like professors kept reiterating, it's a really hard time to join this industry, but it's also such a critical time. And journalists are kind of the people that we turn to for information to figure out what's going on in the world. And a really strong way to make sure that victims or survivors have justice is to hear their stories. So
Absolutely.
the work you're
Again,
doing is
I
so
would say, like,
incredible.
do it, but make sure you love it. Like
Yeah.
if you have a desire for news, if you are like, I'm always checking the news. Like my husband will tell you, like I sit here in front of this computer all day long. It's literally, that's my kitchen behind me so that I can work in the kitchen and do stuff at home and, you know, be checking the news. Because if you don't have that passion for it, if you don't have, like, to me, a great day at work is if there's like an incredibly busy news day, if there's stuff happening and announcements being made and, you know, then there's a snowstorm, like all those things sound like absolute nirvana to me. And there are people that I've known in this business who that sounds like a nightmare to them. And I've said to them, nah, you probably shouldn't be in this business if that's the case, because you really have to have that passion for it. Otherwise, yeah, it won't be any fun for you.